All right, today we're going to continue with texture and value and how we can use value to create texture using line, using different techniques for making line. So before we go and start talking about all these different aspects of value and of texture, I want to start by talking about them in the context of the assignment you all are going to do this week. And this week's assignment is going to be really our first, what I consider full length and full scale work of art, where you're going to create from beginning to end a work of art that's complete. Now, most of what I've asked for you to do up till now is demonstrate a concept, turn in some sketches, gesture drawings, that sort of thing. This I want you to, and that's why we're starting today, talking about it, and we'll work more on it on our make day, but I really want you to get a foundation, understanding of what we're going to do and how you're going to do what you're going to do. And so the assignment this week is you're going to create a complete work of art. This is not complete. This is me starting, showing you sort of, and I'll finish it up during our make day. But you're going to demonstrate 3 different textures, and you're going to include a sphere or an egg, that 3-dimensional oval, and the light, and understanding the shadow and of that egg or that sphere. So we're really combining that value and that texture. How do we achieve texture using line? How do we create the value using line? And so this is sort of one of those all-encompassing works of art that ask you to take a look at several different aspects of both texture and value. So let's look at value in art. And when we're looking at how light reacts to the objects and it's communicated to the viewer's eye, there are several factors that we're going to take into place that kind of help us better understand that what we're looking at is an actual form, and we're creating the illusion that that's in a form so we can demonstrate that it's an actual form. And so I'd like for you to consider the ideas of the highlight, the mid-tone, something we call the core shadow, and cast shadows. We're going to look at where there's highlights in these areas, where there's darker areas where things are reflected, and how the reflected light impacts those shadow areas. So if we can look at this sphere they've got here that's not labeled, we can start to already see some of those guiding principles and so forth. So the first thing we look at is the highlight. What's the area that catches the most light? Well, that's the area that's going to be brightest on that surface, and that's sort of right here in the top right on this white sphere. The next thing we want to talk about is the midtones. And the midtones are really these areas around that highlight and just into the area before we get into that shadow area. And so once we achieve that sort of shadowy side, we get this cast shadow, the shadow that is cast on the ground. A couple things I want you to pay attention to is that the shadow is generally darkest as it's closest to and underneath of the object that is creating that cast shadow. It begins to dissipate, if you will, or become lighter as it reaches that sort of the top or the edge that where the light is most sort of bleeding across. And so we'll see these midtones kind of continue in those areas that are going to be sort of similar to what we see around that area around the highlight before you get to the shadow area on the sphere itself. And then we've got these sort of reflected light areas. So as they're talking about here, you've got the cast shadow, you've got this core shadow, and that's what we're talking about here, the core shadow. That's got the midtones, and they're showing the highlights and the midtones here. But then you've got this reflected highlight, where on the back side that should be in darkness, we see a little bit of light. And what that is, it's reflected light that's coming off of the surface of whatever that object's sitting on. The darker or less reflective that surface is, the less that highlight's going to be evident. But imagine, if you will, like it's sitting here on a white surface, it's going to have quite a bit of highlight. Again, underneath of this sphere, we'll see sort of that highlight. Another thing that happens that they don't really show you a lot in this, I'm going to show you in my example just a little bit, is that not only does the surface cause a reflected or sort of highlight here on the back side, the dark side of that object, but the object itself reflects into the shadow area. And so very often, particularly if the object that we're drawing is very reflective, if it's white and light's bouncing off of it really easily, we'll see sort of this cast highlight or this reflected highlight that's being set off by the object itself. In this case, since it's a white egg, I'm imagining there's probably going to be quite a bit of highlight. Don't forget that the top edge of those shadows kind of bleed out. When we talk about value, anytime we talk about value, we're thinking about it in the idea of gradations, and those are explained in a value scale. Most artists, when they started using a medium, whether it's pen, ink, pencil, watercolor, particularly if it's an ink, a medium that's new to them, they will create a value scale with that medium so that they can understand what they have to do with that medium to achieve the specific level of gradation that they're looking to achieve. When we look at the idea of adding color in our value, we're now talking about tints and shades. When we add white to a color, we get a tint. When we add dark to a color, we get a shade. The basic way to understand it is just sort of like they show you here, as an object catches light, it gets lighter as it gets darker here. So in this case with the red, if we add white to a red, we sort of get a pinkish color, and so it sort of turns pink. And if we add black to a color, we get that shade, and that's kind of what creates those shadows. Very often when we're mixing color, particularly in paints, we'll add a little yellow to those highlights because one of the things we notice often in reds is that as they get lighter, they tend to just skew a little towards that orange range. Doesn't really happen exactly the same way in those shadow areas, but we'll talk more about that when we do color theory later on. Okay, so understanding where your shadow is going to be, because again, your object, or your painting or drawing, I should say, needs to have an object in it that's a sphere or an egg. It's going to sit on a surface. You can have plants behind it. I've used the example I showed you had a brick wall behind it. You can have anything, any kind of texture you want behind it. I was just trying to look for 3 different textures here. So 3 textures, and then one of those is going to be the egg or the sphere. Now the egg or the sphere doesn't have to be really nice and smooth. Just because that's the way I'm showing you the one I'm doing. What if your egg was made of sponge? What kind of texture would that look like, and how could you create that with your use of line? Okay, we're going to look here, continue down. Again, value scales. If you are using cross hatching, if you're using stippling, if you're using a soft blend, if you're using a pencil and you can smudge around with your thumb, regardless of what medium you're using, I recommend that you create a value scale with that medium. So again, if you're using a black pen, I've got these little, they're kind of like Sharpies, but they're made by a company called I think they're Pentel, but it's a Micron. Sakura makes these. They're little black pens, and they just go straight to black. There's no gray or anything. So to create grays, to create the variations, you have to adjust your cross hatching, just like they're showing you here. So think about how a light gray created with hatching is just going to be lines that are sparsely placed. They get slowly closer and closer and closer together. It creates more and more value. Same thing with cross-hatching. We overlay those. Same thing with stippling. If you're using stippling, very light. It's going to be just little dots here and there. As those dots get closer together, they create darker value. Again, value applies across color. It doesn't matter if it's black and white or if it has color. You can still interpret that value. We're going to look at texture real quick. Texture is how something feels or it appears to feel. I love this little example here. It's got all these little cool textures, bumpy textures, woven textures, soft textures, looks like feathers, smooth textures, that looks like metal. Wet textures, I don't know. Wet, it does sort of look like drops. Oh, that might be rough. That looks pretty rough. And of course, that one, the bumpy one, looks really bumpy. And when we're thinking about texture, how you all are going to use texture, we're going to look at this just a second. Again, I went with bricks. It shows that hard and sort of rough texture. You might have your egg sitting on a metal surface, which is going to be super smooth, so really reflective maybe. And you can think about the reflections and how they'll show that smoothness. Maybe bumpy. You might have like burlap, like this woven texture. You might have little woven things that create that burlap look. So think about the different types of textures. Don't make it more difficult on yourself than you have to. Don't try to create. I'm already trying to do hair. Hair is a tough one. I'm going to try to do that on mine. Speaking of hair, if when we think about creating texture, that's a lot of the places we go first. I love this texture of this wolf. We can almost feel the hair. If we almost feel like you could touch that wolf one. If we did, it would be really soft with this long coat of hair, fur. And so, how did the artist do that? Well, the long, thin lines create just like long, thin strands of hair. The use of highlights and the way he's created those highlights, letting that soft highlight trail off into those highlights or trail off into those shadow areas that create this transition that let us feel that fur has turns and curves in it, and like the folds in the neck, we see those dark lines that create that texture of not just fur, but fur that is folding and making these little ripples on that wolf's neck. We think about how different people might interpret texture different ways. This is the same basic thing. A person's face and nose, their eye and nose, I should say. The artist at the top right has interpreted this with stippling. Stippling almost inherently creates sort of a rough texture. It looks like this face may have been cast in maybe concrete or something that has sort of a rough, porous texture. Whereas the one that's in the middle, right below that, has a nose and an eye. But the artist has done a real soft transition, so we almost feel like it's photographic close to it. But we do see some of the artist's lines that they've created in the shadows. Let us know when it's a neat drawing. But also so we can feel that softness, that of the turns and the highlights are really softly handled. We don't see the dark contrast. We see a nice transition that's smooth. The artist in the bottom right has used shadow to create value to create these shadows and highlights that let us know that these are like little spiky things. If you were to step on this, oh my goodness, yeah, that would hurt. And I like the hog, pig there in the middle. Again, the fur and texture, we can feel it very much like the wolf. And then the cone, I wanted to kind of take a look at how, and those hands, how you can consider texture using, and that's stippling in the top, that cone. And so even with stippling, if you're handling the medium very softly, you can create these really soft transitions and gradation changes that'll let you create more than just plain rough texture with that stippling technique. Okay, so what are you going to do? You're going to apply what you've learned today. You're going to start thinking about, start sketching about, and if you want to, go ahead and start working on your idea for what your finished drawing is going to be. I'd like to see them turned in by Friday, and I would like to see it complete, which means from one edge of your drawing to the other, it's going to be full value range from those value 10s, and we'll look real quick again at those value ranges. I want to see a full range of value from the highlights to those darks, from the very lightest to the very darkest, the nines, I guess. But every value in between needs to be interpreted some way, particularly when you're doing that sphere or that ball. You're going to want to show every single level of gradation from 1 to 9 or 10, whatever your scale set up for, if somewhere in your drawing. We don't want white space a lot of the canvas, so think about, again, this is just a start. This is not a finish. I'm going to work on it more, and we'll talk more about what that finished product will look like on our make day. But you should sort of have an idea of what we're going for. When we're done, we want to complete a drawing that represents 3 textures, has a sphere or an egg, the oval form, and I really want these just to be black and white. Let's not delve into color just yet. I want to see how you're creating value and texture just using line. Now you can smudge that line. That's awesome. I love it. That's a soft transition line. You might have real dark line, thin line, bold line, crosshatch line. It's up to you how you use line. But using line to create value, to create texture, that's our assignment. 3 textures, at least 1 sphere or 1 egg. All right, guys, I'll see you again on the make day. Hang around.